Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again this lovely Tuesday afternoon. We appreciate it. Welcome to our fourth download event this year, our third virtual. As many of you know, in Los Angeles, we do a live event each year at the end of February, where this past year, we talked about COVID a grand total of about 30 seconds. So on February 26th, it was becoming important. And 2 weeks later, as we all know, the world changed perhaps forever. So my name is Ryan Harding. I'm an executive managing director with Newmark Knight Frank, headquartered here in Los Angeles, California. We appreciate the overwhelming response over the last 5 or 6 weeks. Many of you have reached out to see what we were doing next. Many have asked us to do certain events, which we are looking at as well. We've put out a series of white papers and information of our own on LinkedIn. Many of it comes from Roy Abernathy, who is our head of workplace, who we'll be speaking with today. Our YouTube views of this each week have been increasing. We are not at Kardashian level yet, but we're certainly at several hundred views. We're really proud of that. So thanks to all of you for your continuing support and chiming in and learning, and most importantly, just being here as we all kind of go through this together. As Jen mentioned a couple weeks ago, we're really proud to have mom and dad on too. Both moms and dads on also, so thank you guys each week. Today, we are going to talk to Roy Abernathy, who Jen's going to get into here in a minute.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ryan. I'm Jen Frisk, and we're back. This is our third webinar, and sounds like we have a little bit more runway left with shelter in place and work from home. So yes, you can all look forward to more promo videos, which I know everyone is enjoying. We've gotten a lot of great questions. Roy is going to address pretty much everything in detail. If you have more throughout, you can obviously use the chat. To answer a question we received prior to with the RSVPs, no, we are not sheltering in place in a bounce house. So we're all still in our homes, which is really great. But in all seriousness, we've had a really great week, a lot of great PR. If you missed it, Ryan was on a local radio station, KNX 1070, talking with Frank Modick. So you can hear that. Also, we were on KTLA, which is a local TV station. We were on their podcast this morning. All of those are linked on our website, which is officecreated.com. And obviously, if you are so inclined, we would love you to follow us on Instagram as well. And then this webinar, when it's finished, will be put up on the website as well. So with that said, we have Roy Abernathy here with us today. He's the head of Newmark's Global Workplace Strategy, and he tells us our timing is really great to do this because we've been looking at these kind of in 45 to 60-day windows, and we're kind of in the start of the next 60-day window. So we're going to turn it over to Roy. He's going to introduce himself and get started. And interestingly enough, I think as most of you know, he has a background in zoonotic diseases. So he's going to run through all of that and introduce himself now.
Well, thanks everyone. Some people say that I've waited my whole career for this pandemic to happen. That's not the case, but conveniently, I have spent the last 30 years focusing on kind of the diseases that go back and forth between animals and humans, and specifically wildlife and humans, which is where we think this virus came from. And a lot of it around either the government infrastructure, the university or private industry aspects of kind of containing these types of these types of viruses that go back and forth between the populations. Worked on level containment with labs all the way up to level 4. And then from a real estate perspective, I've spent time, as many of you might have come from, on the real estate side as a real estate executive, as a consultant with Accenture and Anderson Consulting, and now with Newmark Knight Frank as the head of workplace strategy and human experience. Our team spans the world, so roughly 250 people globally that have been dealing with both the move to the lockdown or shelter in place, starting in China 22 weeks ago, to how we're now globally actually starting to come back. So pretty much every geography around the world has started some sort of migration back into the office, back into our factories, back into the economy. And so when we look at this, you'll hear me talk about BC, which was before Corona. We're kind of IC right now in the middle of Corona, and we're looking at this from an AC perspective or after Corona. And when you consider it, we're looking at kind of the business and environmental factors. So right now, huge pressure to cut costs and to really look at kind of how organizations are going to kind of get through this. New digital channels and business opportunities is kind of where businesses are starting to look. From an environmental perspective, we're all seeing a big change to the environment in just a short hiatus with us working from home and not commuting the ways that we used to, or kind of even having the impact on the environment that we had before Corona. From a real estate and workplace perspective, again, short-term cost focus, with medium-term kind of getting reorganized as we come back into the office. Work from home, and somebody asked me on a call earlier today, you know, our company would have never considered work from home for this, and now it's all we talk about. So kind of that old BC paradigm where we were afraid of it, you know, nothing like getting thrown in the deep end of the pool to get used to swimming. We're all swimming at this point. And then from an organizational perspective, kind of this fact that we've been dispersed while we've worked from home and we've had kind of a local connection. New business models are going to come out of this. And one of the big things that we're seeing play into it is really organizational empathy. And we think that ways that companies might even be measured from a stock value perspective, maybe how empathetic they were and how trusting their workforce was as they went through this process. From how long it's going to take to correct, no one knows. But yeah, we're taking a different approach this time, and that means we'll come out of this differently. And then all you have to do is turn on the radio, the TV, you know, any sort of media channel, and the social and political are kind of getting a ping pong bounce back and forth between, you know, kind of how we're handling it, ultimately kind of how we are handling it. So how our government, how we as a culture are handling it, and then how we're individually handling it. And you're going to continue to see that. It's interesting. This is the first time in any of our histories that something like this has happened at a global scale. If you go back to what happened after 9/11, and we did a focus group with survivors from 9/11, just to talk about kind of when we will forget this. This is the first time we've gone through it where everyone in the globe has been affected at the same time. And so we think a 7 to 10 year cycle for us to forget this one, and kind of, if we ever get back to the old normal, kind of that being the time cycle. So what's my team seeing around the world? So we're coming back. We're coming back in Asia, Germany, Europe. We're coming back in France. We've come back in I live here in Atlanta, Georgia, and we've been back now for almost 2 weeks, which is a little scary. But we can talk a little bit more about that. But what we're seeing, that transportation is the biggest bottleneck, especially in more urban areas, because we just don't have a transportation infrastructure that allows us to socially distance. So we're going to have to find other ways to do that. From how buildings restart, it's going to be critical. So talking to your landlord about that as we start to come back into the environment. There's no such thing as a corona-free building, but certainly what we're going to see, you know, buildings taking temp or at least attempting to or opting into that, increased daily cleaning in the process, and contact tracking, which we've already seen or heard a lot about. And then from a utilization planning, so globally it's more 2 meters as far as socially distancing goes. In the US it's 6 feet. So we're seeing that as kind of the new planning module, at least as we start to come back in. And then the one thing that I would advise any employer to really look at from a sensitivity perspective, there are going to be a lot of family impacts, especially over the next 3 to 9 months, where we're not going to have daycare come back the same way that it existed before. We're having a lot of summer camps that are already canceled. So all of our infrastructure that kind of allowed us to get through the summer and be out of school, in some cases, isn't going to be there this summer. And so, you know, being understanding, focus on family as we go through this, and the implications, especially for families with younger children that just don't understand this and are having a harder time managing through it. So things we're seeing from just a kind of a return perspective, from a what's working well, kind of a QR or survey-based process where we're screening people who are coming back into the environment. So we've already seen, I think it's the state of Colorado, ask employers or have employers ask their employees questions before they come back to help pre-screen the workforce coming back. You're going to see a lot around thermography, which kind of an easy to use version on the right-hand side, where a security guard is using a thermographic camera to take temperatures as people walk through en masse. We've got the ability now to do this at scale, but it is changing so quickly. And I'll talk about one of the places this is going in a few minutes. But from a scale perspective, a big difference from kind of what we've seen in the past.
So Roy, I mean, you mentioned you're from Atlanta, and we know Atlanta and Georgia was one of the first to start to lift their shelter-in-place restrictions. It has now been lifted. Many people on the call are in Los Angeles and certainly in other parts of the country as well. But I mean, what's it feel like in Atlanta right now? Are employers returning their employees to work? Is that the right thing to do? I mean, we're looking at it from our perspective in Los Angeles, where we were one of the early adopters, and we handled it as we mentioned the other day, kind of as and you can get into it as sort of a Canadian approach. In California, Governor Newsom did. I mean, should we be looking at this return to work in a pre-vaccine, post-vaccine sort of standpoint, or what do we need to consider as we start to do this?
I think, and you're right. California was tracking, I think, using a Canadian model for the predictive analytics on population medicine. And I've worked in the past with the Canadian government around some of this. So to some extent, a little more prepared, both from implementing more of a lockdown or a shelter in place, but also even more prepared from a hospital perspective and kind of the infrastructure in the state. Realize that Georgia's the head or the home of CDC. So, to some extent, the people driving the process live here and their families live here. So, I can't say that it was the right or wrong decision. We won't know for a little while. But I think from how we are approaching it as a community and how we're kind of addressing the opportunity to go back, it's very, very slow.
And are so companies actually going? Are companies, are they going back to work?
The ones that really need to are. So in some cases, like we've got a big headquarters here in Atlanta that we work with, that they're going back, they're going to go back in 2 shifts. But for their business never closed down. So they were essential service. So to some extent, they have to support their business, which actually increased in volume as we went through this, because we needed them to get through it. And so they're going back in a way that it's choice-based. So you can decide as an employee whether you feel comfortable coming back, but they're tooling their environment so that by doing 2 shifts, they can offer an opportunity for everyone to come back. But it's really been more by industry. So like legal and that aspect of professional services is coming back much slower to the office because they can be as successful at home. Banks and some financial institutions that are regulated to be open are taking a scaled approach as well. But I don't know of any companies that kind of flipped a switch and said, okay, everybody come back the first day in kind of the same way that we went out. It's very guarded, very phased, and very, very, very integrated into an overall kind of post-COVID environment.
So it's interesting, we were on the phone this morning with a CEO of a company we represent nationally, and he wants to bring them back. They're Midwest based, and he wants to bring them back, and the employees are pushing back pretty hard for public transportation reasons, for just health and wellness reasons in the office. What should we be considering as we reboard the office, both I think from a near term sort of pre-vaccine and then a long-term post-vaccine perspective?
So pre-vaccine, being very careful to kind of communicate the expectations before people come back in. And if you need to bring back in the entire workforce, there are ways to do it. I mean, we're working with companies every day that are doing it because they need to, but being very programmatic in how you do it, setting up the infrastructure and the cleaning protocols, giving the employees advice and counsel on kind of how to do it well and how to be secure and be productive. And then it's really taking 3 to 4 weeks. And this is more from what we're seeing in China and Thailand and other parts of Asia and a few places in Europe. It's going to take 3 to 4 weeks for people to get back and get used to it. I mean, the first week that we came back in China, it was less than 10% of the environment was populated. I mean, restaurants were open, but nobody came. I mean, we're guarded as a culture or as a species and kind of coming back in this process. So there are ways to do it. If it's really critical to business, you can. What we're seeing kind of post-COVID, so once we get a vaccine or once we get herd immunity, is depending on how long we're out, it'll really dictate how close to normal we think we come back. So from like an open benching environment, if we get a vaccine and, you know, by the end of the year, most of the population has been vaccinated and the vaccinations are holding from an immunity perspective, we'll probably get back a whole lot closer to the old densities in our environments than we will if it lags into the middle of next year. And some of it will be just people got normal to that or used to that new normal mode. Got it.
So I know you're going to click through. There's a couple more, but yeah. Go ahead.
So you know, to kind of look at how to frame this or look at how to navigate this, we've created a reboarding process. So kind of similar to having to get off the plane because there's mechanical work that has to happen, and then kind of reboarding in the process. We looked at kind of how to reboard the office and to create a roadmap. And I put a couple of things in here that are both tenant and landlord oriented, so you can kind of see both sides of the conversations that need to happen. But this is available and out there for everyone to use. If you need help through the process, our team's set up to be able to help. But we really wanted to provide something that was easy to use, easy to navigate, and really covered all the things that you need to consider. So we created a 10-step process that really creates a roadmap, and I'll tell you how those are really used. But it starts by really assessing the risk, and it's interesting. Yesterday, the UK government came out, and actually we've worked with them. Our London teams have, saying that it's now legislated in the UK. You have to do a risk analysis as a part of bringing people back into the office. The second thing that we do is a workforce overlay. And so part of what we're finding is you need to understand who in the workforce needs to come back, not just who the company needs to come back. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the third is really a capacity overlay so that you know how much space you might have while we socially distance in the office to really accommodate people in a safe and a comfortable and productive way. And so, you know, one of the big things that we're seeing out of this is there are two big considerations. So one is there are environmental things we can change, which are things like opening the air dampers and letting more fresh air into the mechanical system. We can change the mechanical fixtures and change the mechanical filters and make sure that the systems are operating as well as they can, really to just try to manage the air in the environment and kind of push the virus down to surfaces. There are also behavioral changes, things that we need the workforce to do or change their behavior to do that are like, you know, we may need them to clean their laptop when they come back into the environment, because the laptop may be, you know, one of the primary ways that things could be transferred from the office environment to the home environment.
So I think sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jen.
I was going to say, so I think as we're looking at this, I mean, I think we want to focus on, you know, what are the best practices that should be implemented in kind of the tenant space, because I think there's obviously a lot that needs to be done at the company level. And from that, companies obviously need to help drive those behavioral changes and communicate those to employees. And so curious to know kind of what all of those look like, as well as just kind of the mindset outside of just the logistics, but how is everyone going to feel, and how can employers help their employees feel comfortable and have an understanding of what they're doing, which I know is what this slide looks like.
Well, and so what I'll jump to is just kind of the best practices that you noted. So from an environmental best practice, you know, making it easy and making the transition from kind of home to the office as comfortable as possible. So like have hand sanitizers at the front door or as you come into the space. One of the things that we started advising clients, you know, when we first put this out 4 or 5 weeks ago is kind of remove half the chairs in conference rooms in kind of those shared environments. Part of what we found is that works well, but also if you don't have a place to put them, just kind of roping them off. So, you know, I probably sold more red Home Depot rope than I could ever buy stock in Home Depot to do. But, you know, just using the chair in that situation, if you can't remove it, to clearly indicate you shouldn't sit here. And so using that to socially distance in those environments. We are seeing just a massive amount of waste in Europe and in Asia as we come back. So just we're cleaning more things at a regular basis. And so being careful, using like recyclable towels, trying to manage that volume that we're going to have in the office that we didn't have before from a cleaning perspective. And then, when you look at your lobby spaces, or when you look at spaces kind of throughout the offices that just could get contaminated, really reduce them to what you really need. So like, break rooms, and we're not going to be able to sit right beside of each other in break rooms any longer. And so potentially moving or removing the furniture that might need to be cleaned if we didn't take it out of those spaces because we can't really use it. And then being as touchless as possible across kind of everything we do. There's this cool thing we've always used on the animal side. It's called a toe pull. So it's like a little L-shaped bracket that can go on the back of restroom doors. So you can take the toe of your shoe and kind of open it versus having to grab the handle and kind of open the handle.
It's interesting when you talk about waste. Ryan and I were talking about this, I think it was maybe earlier today, when you look at so much of what was put into place in order to be respectful of the earth, the air dryers in bathrooms, the sinks that turned off the second you moved your hand so that water didn't run. And now we're looking at, no air dryers because that blows the virus around. Sinks with water that stays on longer so that employees are washing their hands for the recommended amount of time. It's interesting to see a little bit of a reversal in kind of some of those practices, like you mentioned with the waste.
And the worst thing we could do is kind of, go through this in a way that increases our impact to the environment as we come back. So, to your point, trying to find things that are recyclable, trying to find things that are water-based, and that from a chemical perspective are not, chemical-based or oil-based in the process. And then ultimately, managing that in a way that it can be recycled. And so working with the landlord, working with the vendors that kind of provide those services to really do the right thing as we kind of continue to navigate through this. From a behavioral perspective, one of the coolest things I think is coming out of this, and this is just a kind of a Roy perspective, is we're going to have a new handshake. So kind of owning that within your culture as an organization is becoming kind of a really cool thing. And so when you think about it in kind of Asian cultures, we've kind of always had a bow to some extent, but I like the digital hug because you can see me kind of do this over video conferencing, or, and I don't want to kind of brand this for the tech side, but, we're seeing companies kind of make this a thing and really try to integrate it, because we're going to come back and we're going to want to connect to people in the environment, and we're not going to shake hands and we're not going to give people a hug when we come back. So finding a way that really people remember. And I mean, we're going to tell stories about this in some cases well beyond retirement. And so, building something into your culture that helps people really come back. So some really critical things is work with the workforce to keep it light. I mean, we've got something out there that Madeline with our change management team did on kind of coaching people on what should go back and forth. Don't bring your Post-it notes from home into the office. We probably have Post-it notes in the office. And just as providing another mechanism for the virus to travel with us. And then once you get those things into the office, like, the first thing you should do is sit down and clean the work area you're going to work in, and then clean your laptop before you put it on that work area. One of the biggest things we're finding is we tend to carry our laptop around with our thumb on the keyboard surface and our 4 fingers under the laptop. And then we go set that laptop in different places throughout the office. I mean, we're just picking things up and kind of bringing them back to our work environment. So leave your laptop in one place when you get it there, clean it before you put it down, and definitely clean it again before you put it in your bag and take it home, so you don't take anything home with you. And do the same thing with the power cords and the cables in that process, and the same thing with your cell phone. And this sounds simple, but we saw this in parts of Asia. People come back into the office and we've just gotten so used to like clicking on Amazon and things that we've been ordering, and we'll have them shipped to the office because now we're not at home and we're afraid somebody's going to take them off the door stoop. Right. Still ship those things home. And Amazon's gotten much better at tracking those things. So kind of being careful in that part of the process. And so, other things to consider in the process really comes back to the landlord's responsibility. And I know Jen and Ryan, we talked about kind of where that has gone. So you should start this conversation as you consider coming back, so well into planning before you ever actually take action. Talk to the landlord about how you're going to access the building. How are visitors, employees going to come in? How's the UPS guy going to bring your packages up, or the FedEx guy? Are they going to hold them somewhere in the building? How are the common areas going to work? Whether it's just access up to the elevators or to your floor, whether it's retail or food service. One of the things we're finding in taller towers is you may set it up, and I like the old ice cream connotation that somebody gave me the other day. For me as kids, kind of growing up in the Southeast, like the ice cream truck would come through our neighborhood and all the kids would like run to the ice cream truck. So think about, if you're a tall tower, have like pop-up food services that might be showing up on like every 3 or 4 floors around lunchtime, so your staff's not having to go downstairs. And I come from the animal side, so if you think about herd health, the whole way that we manage herds of animals is we try not to introduce kind of outside elements into the herd. And so think about that from your office population. Do things as you come back to get employees to kind of stay in the office when they're in the office, and kind of, get that commitment from when they come in. But try to limit the number of kind of invasive things that might come into the office while they're there. So even like office supplies and other supplies that you might use, the virus has a half-life, or has a duration that it can last from an exposure perspective on certain surfaces. So when supplies come in, isolate those supplies and don't open them for a period of time until you know the virus is no longer viable on those supplies. Ask the landlord kind of how they're going to do cleaning protocols. What we do know of one situation where a janitor actually moved the virus from tenant to tenant to tenant because they were using the same cleaning materials. And then from a cleaning specs, making sure that your landlord and the janitorial services are really using the right things to clean. So not just using the old process and the old product, but really looking at how we need to do it today. You're going to get questions from the landlord when you start this conversation, so be prepared to answer those. Landlords are going to want to know, like, when are you planning to come back? What is the time frame, so that they can prepare? Are you going to have visitors or contract employees or vendors come into your space? Are you as a tenant going to put in protective measures? Are you going to ask employees to wear masks when they're in the office or when they come into and out of the office? And then, are you going to change office hours? And do you have any specialty spaces internally? So we have a lot of clients who are going to put like a holding room or a isolation room that they're going to identify in their space. The landlords need to know to clean that differently than they may just an office space. So really understanding and being able to have this conversation between the landlord and the tenant is important. They may not ask you on the first day, but they may ask you in a later conversation, what's your occupancy strategy going to be? So are you just going to bring back in essential employees? We've seen a lot of different models around this, and everything down to like alternating days or weeks. I will tell you there's a scientific way to beat this virus. And so like one good example is we have a pharmaceutical retailer that's going to do week on, week off. And so what they're doing is group A within the workforce comes in 1 7-day period of time, or over 1 7-day period of time. Group B comes in the following week. And so the cool thing is the early symptoms from the virus show up within 7 days. And so they're making sure that the team is out of the office for a full 7 days. So when they screen them to come back in, they have the highest probability of showing symptoms. So using the time frame to kind of defeat the virus. They're going to ask about service and amenities. So do you plan to bring in lunch and stuff like that? And then from an additional cleaning protocol, what spaces do you need cleaned? And then are you going to do any screening measures? And Jen, you talked about kind of the different phases of how we might come back in. We don't think we're going to travel for business over this next, 90 to 120 day period of time. And I personally will be missed by Delta and United because I spend so much time on those two airlines. But, you may want to consider having employees who travel for business keep travel journals. And I know in talking to the airlines, they're building profiles around travelers or business travelers as we come back, both to help them, even in like rerouting through different parts of the country, but also to be able to do that contact tracking.
And everything that you just mentioned and talked about with landlords, is that, is that covered under current leases? Is that something where there's kind of legal ramifications that are going to occur if landlords don't comply and don't do some of the things you just mentioned? And then this is a very LA specific question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is valet parking safe, or is this the end of a stranger getting in your car and, we're all going to have to go back to Clueless and learn how to parallel park? How is that specific to?
This is very important,
So
Roy, with how you answer it. So please be careful with Jen's wording.
No, and so, I come from a car culture, probably, one of the parallel cultures in the country to, I think our mass transit is probably has less capacity than yours does, from an infrastructure perspective. I don't think valet is going to go away, but it is funny when I dropped my car off for service earlier, that the one, I never got close enough to actually touch the person who was taking custody of my car. They immediately like covered the steering wheel and covered the seat before they got into the car. They even explained to me, like, the person working on my car was going to use a set of tools that had already been cleaned for the car. So, I think the smart valets are going to certainly understand how to do this and do it well. The issue, Ryan, is you're probably going to have to wait another 10 minutes to get your car back at the end, because it's going to take them a little longer to kind of prepare it for you to get it back. But if it was ever one of those times to use that little weird keyless entry thing that you have for your key and have them clean it before they hand it to you, now's probably the time to not give them your whole set of keys, but give them something that's kind of simpler in your protocol of handing the key over.
So we're lucky we have good weather here in Los Angeles, is what you're saying, because we're going to be sitting at it for a while.
You do, and everybody's kind of there's a lot of predictions around kind of how the warmer climate is going to affect the virus. And if we look back historically at other COVID type viruses, so like SARS and other, but we think that it'll certainly diminish the virus. But this virus had a very different way of jumping from human to human than the others did. So we're taking a cautious view of that, even relative to kind of the warmer climates. And if you look at what happened in Brazil, which was more in a warmer climate as they went through this, and maybe took a different approach to social distancing, we haven't seen as much of a decrease there either.
So one of the questions we're getting a lot of, sorry, Roy, yep. One of the questions we're getting a lot of right now and during this, and thank you for all of you that are texting me, Jen, I don't know if you are too, but this is a lot of change and a lot for people in any position.
Wait.
Whoa.
You didn't answer my other question.
What was that?
About landlords and our leases. The lifeblood of what we do.
So I'm out of order. What can I say?
No,
you take it from here.
No, and Jen, it's a very pertinent question, and it's going to be interesting to see when we get into like lease and common area maintenance and kind of building charges when we get back into the beginning of next year, and kind of how all this plays out. And as everyone knows, different leases are written differently in different situations and different buildings, and with different legacies, older leases versus newer leases. And so try to be clear when you're having this conversation with the landlord about where those charges are going to go, and kind of understand that as you go into this. I talked to a client earlier today that she said, okay, well, we've got like 150,000 square feet. We're just going to go back in and clean everything from day one, the way we need to do in the new protocol, but we're only going to bring in 10% of the people. I'm like, well, why would you open more than 25% of the space to address 10% of the people? And she's like, well, I never thought about that. I just thought I'd prepare the whole office. And so be smart and be strategic as you go through this, and realize that there may be more opportunity for exposure in opening 150,000 square feet than really opening a 25,000 square feet for 10% of the workforce and doing all the right things. But there are things that kind of clearly fall on the landlord and the tenant side of the line relative to this. Be careful what you request from a cleaning perspective versus what the landlord offers. And that's why we're suggesting that ask the landlord first what they're going to do. And then look at your lease or call Jen and Ryan and have them walk you through it. If you have caps on annual increases, those caps may hold as you go through this. As far as overall common area or maintenance charges, the issue is this may also be considered an emergency and have other terms in the lease that may override those caps. So one, be careful now, understand and kind of go and look and don't get surprised. Number two, I think we'll have kind of a really broad audit season when we get to next year around some of these charges and where they ended up landing on both sides, and kind of misunderstanding certainly around the leases. But, you know, understand we've got to do this together, that there's never a time for the tenant landlord relationship to be weaker. I mean, we need those to be strong as we go through this. And so having those conversations, having them early and really doing this together is what we need to do as we go through this process. So generally, we've got categories out on the piece we have posted on the tenant side that show where we think it lands. So everybody can go out and download that. It's on part of the recommendations or considerations page. So that can provide a little more clarity around individual line items.
May I move forward, Jen?
You are allowed, yes.
Thank you.
Proceed.
So I started to say there's a lot of change here, and we're talking about a lot of change. And truly, I've received a number of texts from people on the phone right now about how to implement that in an effective way. I mean, how can companies implement, you know, effective change management and perhaps most importantly, the messaging of that change?
But and so I guess to accomplish it, I suggest we one of the things that's kind of not compartmentalizing, but kind of dissecting the approach. And so the first is kind of understanding the risk as you come back into the office and being able to communicate that. So whether it be signage or whether it be like, how are we going to use the restrooms when we come back? Where should you sit in the break room? Where do I need to wear a mask versus where can I take the mask off when I'm in the office? And how do I deal with things that are like copiers, or, you know, you don't want everybody to, like, you know, go through the office supplies looking for those Post-it notes when they get back into the office and kind of touch everything looking for the Post-it notes. You want to kind of do that in an organized way. So the first thing is to really do a risk overlay and kind of take your office, look at where the high risk and medium risk areas are and where the low risk areas are. And you may want people to kind of clean their individual environment. Some things not to forget. Everybody is so focused in like queuing in the lobby to take the elevator up to their floor. They're forgetting, like your valet, Brian, you may have to wait longer on your floor to get out of the building. And so you may have to queue when you're in your space to kind of take the elevator down and out, or even queue at the stair to get out. So don't forget that in the model, and don't forget to kind of look at how that backup might kind of affect the circulation. And there's been a lot of kind of discussion around kind of one-way traffic in offices. Where you can do it one way is great, but more importantly, look at the intersections or the potential where people run into each other, whether they're doing one or two-way traffic. So like coming out of an elevator into a corridor, coming out of the restrooms, you know, just those places where people might run into a blind corner. And then don't forget the high touch devices. So card readers, touch screens, reservation systems, the button on the coffee maker, you know, those types of things that are really, you know, everybody in the office during one day may touch those spaces. And then if there was ever a great time to go more paperless, it's now, so that people aren't kind of digging through those copies that are in the printer to try to get to where they are. And so that gives you an idea of kind of your high risk areas. The second thing is to kind of take your building floor plate and do kind of an old architectural model, which is, we call it an overlay. So it's like taking your floor plan and looking at how many people can we get into the office if we socially distance. And so this gives you the capacity for who you might be able to bring in, or the population you might be able to bring in. And we've got this posted out on the website, so you can actually take this and go out and look. And a lot of clients are doing this, where they're taking this and kind of, you know, doing their own approach. But we've created a way to really look at enclosed spaces and open spaces in a way that you can really help the workforce identify kind of where they can sit and socially distance and kind of clearly mark those spaces.
Hey, Roy,
and then the last one is, sorry, Ryan.
Before you move on, actually, really an interesting question just came in about stairwells and floor plans. And I should note, I think you'll agree, but we believe that these plans are going to be important whether you're 5,000 feet or 500,000 feet, square feet. It really doesn't matter. We're showing you, the audience, floor plans, large floor plans, but it doesn't really matter your size at all. Would you agree? I mean, this is more about, like you said, the high touch
I think it's
areas.
actually, it's more important the smaller you are. And so I think the smallest one we've done is 732 square feet, where we needed to bring 5 people back into the office. And the issue became really how that group was going to be able to share those offices and still work together. And this was critical. I mean, this was a family business that, you know, this core made the decision for, you know, multiple $1 million within an organization. And, you know, they had to do it from their office in some cases because of some of the legacy systems and the connections they had.
Right.
And so, you know, honestly, the smaller, the more difficult in some cases that it can to really be to manage this, and the more critical it is.
And what do you think about, like, many buildings are going to block off, many buildings traditionally block off stairwells during work hours, you know, fire emergency exit stairwells. Do you think buildings will start to open those up in order to try to reduce elevator traffic? Because we've read a lot that the average tenant or the average person will travel by stair no more than 10 floors. Do you think that they start to open that up for lower floors?
That may be an LA thing. We can only get them to do 4 here in Atlanta. So, so we're,
this is coming out of New York, to be fair.
That was from New York. That's true. That is true.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in New York for a summer and I had a 6th floor walk up. I'm not sure that I'd take that apartment today, but yes, we're seeing it. And certainly for the first 4 or 5 floors that tenants will avoid kind of the hazard, or sorry, the delay of taking the elevator up to do that. And most of them are very comfortable, but you're going to have some people who have to take the elevator to get to the space for different reasons. But yes, what we're seeing kind of landlords institute an up-down stair, and people are they're asking me questions. Well, Roy, what happens in a fire emergency? I mean, the reality is the fire marshals and the way they're looking at it right now, we're only loading most of these buildings back at 20-25%. And so to get everybody out of the building in the same time frame that we might have before, you know, it looks like we can socially distance if we're only doing 20-25% to get those people out. But long term, depending on how long this takes and how you might kind of load a building, the fire marshals will get concerned if we get past 40, 50, 60% occupancy in the model. But yes, and I don't know if I have it in here, but I have a landlord view of kind of how to deal with elevators in this process. So one of the things we're doing, and this was an example of a building that's 16 stories tall, so no 13th floor, where there were 8 elevators that serviced the building. And in this case, the landlord came back and said, you know, how can we manage this in the process? And so we looked at how many occupants the different tenants wanted to bring back initially in the process, average ride time of 6 minutes. And because of the elevator cab, and there are really only so many elevator cabs that have really been created since the early 80s. So we've analyzed most of those footprints to understand how many people you can get in the elevator. And the CDC is also saying that you can be closer than 6 feet for short periods of time as long as you wear a mask. So in this case, we could get 4 people per trip. But this shows you that we could load all the floors over a 2-hour period of time with everybody taking the elevator, and the longest ride being 6 minutes, by dedicating and saying, like, one elevator will go from the first floor to 16 and 17 and then come back. And it was cool. I went to the doctor's office today for blood work. They had to take the buttons out of the elevator for the floors the elevator didn't go to. So there were like holes where those numbers would have been before. I had not seen that before. So I have pictures if you want of that. So that was my doctor's kind of approach to doing it. But the big thing you see is for those first 4 floors, it would take us 4 hours to load. So you're going to see landlords do that because they're reacting to, you know, we'll have more people take the stair for those first 4 floors. And so maybe in New York, we could do that midway in the building in this case.
Right.
But this one wasn't one of them.
And what do you see happening I mean, I guess to that point, we're in a 34, 35 story building. It's been 2 months since I've been there. I don't even remember anymore, but I think 34-story building in downtown Los Angeles. We're on the 25th. Are we still on the 25th floor, Jen? I think we're on the 25th floor.
Last time I checked, but it's been 2 months, so.
Right. So I think we're on the 25th floor. I mean, do you think that there is a situation where they actually, unless there's a handicap reason or something like that, where they're basically saying, if you're on the first 5 floors, you must take the stairs? Does that happen?
And we have had landlords come back and say that. And you know, honestly, from a lot of this is going to be, we're smart about this, and probably smarter than we're giving ourselves credit for, from a social distancing and from an understanding and doing the right thing perspective. So, you know, you would have already seen a majority of the population migrate to that if the option was open. So it really comes back to that conversation with your landlord. And there are a lot of other things you should consider. So let's say that you know, and I know we don't have this in LA, but let's say that you're 5 floors of that building above floor 15. You may go in and have a discussion with your landlord. I'm going to have my staff that needs to come in between 7:30 and 8 and 8:30 and 9. And I want you to dedicate a bank of elevators like a Disney Fast Pass to my staff getting up during that period of time. And I don't want my staff riding the elevator with any other tenants. And I'm doing that to kind of protect the herd health of our population. So my staff's not exposed to anybody else's staff in the building. And I'm doing that and communicating that to my staff to show them that as an organization, we're protecting them. And I'm doing the right thing for the landlord too, because I'm guaranteeing that we'll come in during those intervals, and that we'll work with them to kind of manage that elevator capacity as we go forward. So a lot of unique things like that around kind of how do you have that conversation and work together in the process.
And is that something that like people like Jen and I are negotiating in leases in the future? You know, we want for the next 5 years, we want, you know, we're big enough, we're a full floor or 2 floors or whatever. We want these elevators between 8:30 and 9 because we want to guarantee that our employees can get up in a reasonable manner so we can keep the business efficient and profitable and productive and all of those buzzwords.
And you want to build flexibility into it, but you know, one of the cool things I think we're going to see in leases is going to be kind of emergency states. So like, here's what we do when there's a declared emergency relative to the office space. You know, here's what we have the right to do as a tenant when these types of things happen. And here's what the landlord should do versus here's what we should do in those situations. Because, you know, the earth is mad, and I'll get a little bit of my soapbox. The earth is mad at us. And if it's not clear that the earth is not mad with us, just the inhale, exhale that the earth has done as we've all slowed down and stayed at home, it is kind of a clear indicator at this. And so if we're not careful, this will happen again. And I'm not doom and gloom from a predictive perspective, but there are lots of other nasty things that are out there in the world that could take this same path kind of through our species.
And there's, on that note, there's 2 other kind of landlord related questions that just came in. One specifically about Douglas Emmett, which we all know, if you're in Southern California, they're one of the biggest landlords here in the Los Angeles region. And we can probably say this isn't that surprising, but one of the people who is in one of their building has said that they aren't making any accommodations and all they're doing are following the government guidelines, and there aren't any clear requirements, just suggestions. So what should tenants, if they have kind of a passive or a landlord who prefers to operate at kind of a lower standard, I guess I'll call it, you know, what can they do? And then we actually had another note from a landlord on the call, Divco, who's been a great partner to us here in LA, that they're actually providing tenants like tool keys that are made out of brass so that they can use them to touch different places throughout the buildings or the elevators. So I thought that was an interesting kind of a very tale of 2 cities with 2 very different landlord styles. So thanks, Sarah.
And you know, we're seeing that all around the world. And I think the landlords who are not empathetic as we go through this process are going to get asked in the future. So that's more of a predictive thing. But we're unusual when you compare us to anywhere else in the world from a regulatory perspective, both because of our freedoms and because of our restrictions. And so this has been a struggle for us from a regulatory perspective, because there is no national protocol for this to be a national restriction or a national set of guidelines. It can only be suggestions. This really has to come out state by state by state by state. And we've seen those states that have gone back well and early be very prescriptive in what needs to happen. So Colorado is a good example of the state defining how we have to come back. California, again, took a guarded approach going into this and is taking a guarded approach coming out. So I think there will be more restrictions in California that may force the landlord to do things that they may not be doing in this case. So in that case, it may be a wait and see with that landlord. If there's just no other way around it, I mean, certainly bringing you guys into the process and kind of understanding what the lease really requires that the landlord do in this process. But, also, if there's no other protocol, kind of bringing in the resources to be able to do it under the tenant's rights and responsibilities is the other way around this. And realizing that way the lease is written, the cost may fall on the landlord or tenant side naturally. It may not be any difference in kind of how you pay for it as a tenant in the process as well. So all this comes back to like how the agreement was written. In a lot of cases, they just weren't written for this. And so understanding that and acting accordingly is going to be important.
Roy, a lot of people are asking us, especially in the last 2 weeks and even right now on the call, what's Newmark doing? So maybe in a minute or 90 seconds, what's Newmark? What's our plan? And can we talk about our plans right now in terms of what we're thinking?
Well, we're certainly drinking our own Kool-Aid from coming back into the office. So we're following the protocols that we've created. I'm working with all of our offices, and our team's kind of putting together our comeback plan. So that's kind of the meat and potatoes aspect of it. And the one thing that everybody should consider is we're going to have 3 buckets within the workforce, and we have this as well. Kind of those critical people that need to be in the office to do their job. Those people that may need to come in because they don't have the infrastructure at home to be able to be successful, and then the people who can work well from home for the next 6 months. So we're starting by kind of analyzing the workforce to see who needs to come back in, who has to come back in, and who can remain from home, and communicating that. But we're also looking at some really cool stuff. So this is kind of the, every aspect of kind of what we're going through, there are opportunities as well. And so one of the big things we're seeing is huge changes in cleaning protocols. So new compounds that are being created, new ways to kind of protect the environment from how we clean it, new communication tools. And so, this is an example of a tool that's phone and computer based, but you can push real updates and communicate with the workforce. You can communicate with visitors. This one can actually tie into a kiosk. So I'm not associating taking the temperature with the individual, but that little red kiosk or little red monitor on the kiosk, when you go up and check in, it takes your picture and it just tells you whether you have a normal temperature green or an abnormal temperature red. So it's letting the individual kind of screen in that case, but also things around being able to do touchless door access. You're going to see a lot of that where these tie into the elevators or into doors, and then things around e-commerce. So I can like order lunch and have it delivered up to that little drop off with the ice cream truck. And then some of the other really cool things are around like thermography being partnered with AI to really focus on kind of how to read temperatures in the environment, but also how to look at a population and say that the characteristics of this individual, although we're not tracking who it is, we've not seen that person in the building before. And kind of, the fact that in this case, this person's also not wearing a mask. So we may need to educate that person as they come into the building. So really kind of intuitive ways to do that. And so from a firm perspective or a Newmark, kind of looking at how we help ourselves and how we help our clients, really keeping track of kind of where this technology is coming from a screening perspective, from a communication perspective, and from a cleaning perspective, because we think those are kind of the 3 big ways we're going to beat this virus, and the next one, which is probably more important, honestly, than beating this one.
What? Go ahead, Jen.
Well, I was going to say, I think there's two things. One, and I know we had kind of talked about this yesterday with you, Roy, but when you talk about the next virus, if we were to go back in time 6 months, what could we have done to prepare for this? And as we look forward, what is important to prepare for the next one? And I think that ties into our other question about, are we ever going back to what it was before pre-COVID? Will the workplace ever be as dense as we've gotten? I think those two probably go hand in hand, but post-vaccine, does a lot of this stay in place, or do we go back?
Well, one thing that we've done is we've worked with a group of futurists, and I've done this all the way back to my days at Accenture, because we have a cognitive bias to look at kind of this disruption in a certain way, and we always will from now on because of the experience we just went through. But some of the things that we incorporate into our longer term model and kind of helping clients look is what if business travel doesn't ever come back the way they did before? And it may be a hard thing to consider, but when you think that China's already canceled visas for long-term residents from other countries that have been in China, they're not letting them come back. But when you think about, new protocols at the airport that may slow us down, that there's a whole series of futures that we've created as a part of a way to help us and to help clients kind of look at what the future could be, and both what the disruptions are going to be, which is what we're so focused on right now, but also where opportunities might lie and kind of how organizations are going to come out of this. I think when you ask, how are we going to come back? What are the long-term aspects of this? Again, it's going to depend on how long we're kind of immersed in it. And so again, that kind of cultural or societal memory that we go through, what will be a big indicator. I think honestly, when I look at kind of other similar situations, if I just had to kind of carve out the US, I would say that the US is probably going to forget this faster than some other cultures around the world. But we may keep a mask in our drawer at home long term. We may do things that are a little protective that we just haven't done in the past. And every time somebody coughs in the office for probably the first 5 years, everybody else in the office is going to turn around and you're going to know who that person was. And if they cough the next day, you're probably going to leave the office and go home after lunch. And some of that's just going to be, kind of an overreaction. So we need to take measured reactions. But as far as the physical environment changing, and I had a conversation with a client who built their building was built in 1915. And I'm like, your building was built pre the Spanish flu. Did they change your building after the Spanish flu? And he's like, well, no, it's historic. It all goes back to 1915. And I said, well, your building was literally like the newest, greatest tech right before the Spanish flu. And so, when we think about this from a long-term institutional memory, I think we'll change our behaviors more than we'll change our environments initially. And I think that's going to be what we all see coming out of this. And that's what we're going to have to manage as we go through it. So if I was going to say that, where would the biggest percentage shift be? I think our behaviors will change more drastically initially and then kind of scale back. I think our physical environments will change more to address technology and kind of the forensics around this virus, the things that we're going to learn from it. And some of that's just going to be because of the economy recovering. But if I have to say kind of what the new normal will be, it will be a much different behavior in probably a similar environment to what we're in today.
And as we start to wrap up here, one quick question that came in: do we have the specs on the smart thermography setup that we could share with people?
What we do, and we have kind of 3 levels. So yes, we can share those.
Okay, so that was one. And then the other is, as we go, Jen has her favorite last question, but is there anything else that we should be thinking of from a transition standpoint and going back to work that we haven't touched on today?
A measured response. Don't overreact. Don't listen to the hype. Look at the science. Any product or application that somebody suggests to you, say, how does this specifically address COVID-19? not how does it address a virus, not how does it address a bacteria, how does it address the one we're dealing with right now, because it is unique in a lot of ways. And the last thing is wash your hands. And when you finish, wash your hands again. And when you go to the restroom, wash your hands. And when you get in the car, wash your hands and use your hand sanitizer. And don't touch the valet, Ryan. When you take the key from him, wipe it down with your hand sanitizer. The thing that we'll probably miss the most, but it'll go away the fastest, will be the handshake.
The handshake, yeah. And so real quick, this is my own personal poll. Jen, what is your preference for Newmark going forward? Handshake, over the heart, fist pump, elbows?
Oh, well, I was going to end our call with it. So now you're making me give it away like 2 minutes early.
Oh, bummer. Well, then before you get into the big grand finale here, a lot of questions have come in. Yes, we are going to provide this presentation deck. We just didn't want to tell you guys because we wanted to keep as many of you on the phone as long as possible. So that was just pure self-marketing and promotion. So we are going to provide that along with a recording when we send out our Beyond the Webinar email, which we've been sending out after these. We will have the presentation and a recording of the webinar. Jen and Roy for the big finale.
Well, and just before we do wrap up with our last question, obviously Roy is a really amazing resource. So if anyone on the phone wants to set up a follow-up meeting with us and with him, we can definitely arrange that. And then a general PSA to Ryan's specific clients that are on the call. If the valet is going to take an extra 10 minutes, Ryan will now be an additional 10 minutes late to your meeting.
That's right. For a total of 20 minutes.
It'll be like 12 to 15. So just FYI.
May 12th, you were forewarned. Yes.
And as we always like to finish, and Roy did not talk about this in our pre-call, so I'm excited to see what he has to say. But, we like to finish with, what do you think is the most positive thing to come out of this for you, either personally or professionally or generally from the world standpoint?
So for me, I live on a cattle farm north of Atlanta. So if I didn't go to the grocery store or watch the news, I would have totally missed all of this. But, I have gotten to spend time with my family in a way that we don't normally get to spend time. So for me, this has been an opportunity to kind of, connect in a way when the world is there's high anxiety, but the planet's kind of taking a breath in what we're doing. And so my kids have been amazed at how much the wildlife has changed as we walk through parks. I went running this morning and I saw a fox in the little hometown that I live in that kind of crossed the road that, we would have never seen before. And, so I think that we should all take pause as we go through this and to some extent remember that, we're a part of an ecosystem, and that ecosystem wants to coexist with us, and that the more we learn from this, the more that we'll be able to prevent this in the future.
We appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining. One of the coolest things that happened today that you wouldn't have seen that we got to see was actually that the number of participants was increasing during the call. And as we got into about 25 minutes, more people jumped on, which means you guys are telling people about this and getting on, which means Roy, as we expected and as we've come to know for years now, you were terrific. So thank you very much. As Jen mentioned, Roy and his team are working with a lot of our clients, many of you on the call right now, about and actually installing these plans and working through them both with landlords and within your own organizations. So he and we are available to assist with that. We are already planning our number 4.4, 4.5, whatever it is this year, in a couple of weeks, and we will follow up with something interesting and relevant at that time. But we thank you all for joining. Roy, thank you so much for all of your time and energy and effort that's put into this. This was terrific. So thanks everybody.
And the new
Have a great one.
I'm going with this.
There we go. Be well. Be well.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Roy.